Could I please invite onto the stage Manuel Correa, the film director, Mireille Fanon Mendès France, and Nelson Maldonado Torres. Let me introduce Manuel to you. He is a Colombian artist and filmmaker. Currently, he's doing work with the Research Architecture Program and the Forensic Architecture Project at Goldsmiths in the University of London. He doesn't work with any particular medium, but instead forms part of a new group of art professionals that are interested in the spaces available in the art world to share ideas and creative explorations. His work deals with digital and post-conflict memory reconstruction in contemporary societies. In 2016, his video Art Offline was premiered at the Rotterdam International Film Festival. His videos have been presented in venues such as the Rufino Tamayo Museum, Presentation House Gallery, the University of Copenhagen, the Medellin Museum of Modern Art, the 8th Norwegian Sculpture Biennial, Kunststerners, who's in Oslo, Palazzo Grazi in Venice, Cali's Arts Foundation, DOK Leipzig. You get the picture. And of course, I don't need to introduce the other two panelists, Nelson Maldonado Torres and Mireille Fanon Mendès France. Instead, what I would like to do to begin with is to share a story. Is the story of my father's auntie. My father is a man from the Caribbean. His family is part Wayu, an indigenous group living in the Guajira province in Colombia, and part African Latin American. I never met my grandmother, but I met my great auntie. And this story has to do with something that, if memory serves me well, Lara, Stephen, and Jorge talked about this morning, the meaning of return, the various meanings of the word return. For my auntie, mi tía abuela, return meant going back to her rancheria. A rancheria is an indigenous settlement for the Wayu people in Guajira. And she did so in January 2004. In April 2004, April that same year, a group of men, not very different from the ones you saw portrayed in the film by the mothers in the play within the play that characterizes the film we just saw. After those men had left this town, called Bahia Portete, 12 people were dead, and my auntie was never found. And that's one story. And what I would like to begin with, Manuel, is precisely with the power of those stories and the power of stories of return. The film is in very many ways a classical documentary. You tease out various elements. Some of them are philosophical, some of them are aesthetic, some of them are sociological or political. Some of them have to do with international mediation or peace mediation and human rights, and those are the elements of a play within the play. What does that very, very classical format do to us that you have chosen to reproduce it in your film?
Yes, sure. And thanks for being here, everybody. Well, this is a very good question. Actually, I actually had more problems with the documentary film format as such than I had reasons to go for it. Some of the problems, of course, is that film is linear. So you have to edit something so that it is more or less coherent. There is something, very violent about editing a documentary in the sense that, especially if you are in the quest for looking for truth in the documentary, or you try to produce something more evidentiary, I think a documentary editor is very similar to a judge in a court case, in the sense that you have a compilation of all the evidence, and then you try to spin this evidence into the most convincing narrative that you can produce. In a sense, like a court case, the judge is convicted, this person is convinced. So I think there's some violence to that. So I did not want to do that. This is why I tried to make something that was more rhizomatic, and sort of like the chapters were presented without evidentiary intentions. I did not want to particularly find what happened in any particular given situation about the conflict, because the question was about memory. The question was about, now that we have a conflict that has been going on for more than 50 years. We don't really know, and I think as a Colombian I can possibly say that we, like Colombians and including me, don't really know what happened, because the way that this war was waged, it was a war against evidence. So we never really knew who did what, why did they do it, who were the ties that were part of this conflict in many of the cases. So after a conflict like this ends, something very profound happens. I mean, whether the conflict is ended or not is very debatable, and I absolutely do not think it's ended. If anything, I think it's just changing, its face. But a peace negotiation aims at, securing a future. So, like, when you sign a peace agreement, you know what the future is. But an agreement like the Colombian one opens something very, very profound and very deep. Is that all of a sudden the past itself becomes a ground for experimentation, and it's upon this past, upon deciding collectively what happened, that we then start manipulating what we want this future to be. So, in a sense, what really interests me is not so much trying to find what happened in this sense, because there's incredible journalists, filmmakers, there's a Truth Commission now in Colombia that is doing an incredible job at doing this. What I wanted to bring into the foreground was, how do we construct a memory together in a time when this is being called for, and for what, for which reasons? Of course, and this I think should include other understandings of truth, for instance.
I'm now going to pass on the mic to Mireille. Mireille will chair the rest of the panel. I've just abused my position because I was dying to ask these questions to Manuel, and I had to share that story, otherwise I couldn't speak. So, Mireille, please.
Thank you, Oscar, and thank you for your documentary. I'm interested by, because I wrote a report on a peace agreement, but with a focus on Afro-Colombian, what was the peace agreement regarding the situation of Afro-Colombian. And right now, the peace agreement have no effect on the situation of Afro-Colombian, as you know, because they are still killed, displaced, and under threat. And since the beginning of this year, there is 374 now human rights defenders who were killed, and the government did not do anything about that. That's why also the perspective. I was interested by the sentence you said. If you sign peace agreement, you know what the future will be. And I'm a little bit disturbed by this, because I don't think if we look after certain peace agreement, even after the First World War in Versailles, we went to the Second World War. After the Algerian independence war, there is independence. But what kind of independence for Algerian people? As now we can see, every Friday there is demonstration because they are not recognize this military power. And exactly, I would like to know exactly what do you mean by that, if I may.
Of course, thank you for your question, Marielle, and it's a very good question. Well, what I mean in this particular case, it's a little bit cynical. I mean, of course, like, we know what the future will be. Society will think there is peace in a sense, but what we really witness when we see peace agreement signed in this sort of situation is a modernization of war. So basically, you take I mean, and this is very cynical and a little bit dark, but you take one armed group that has been fighting a guerrilla war that has not been updated since the 60s, 70s. There has been, technological upgrades in this form of war, in this sort of nonlinear war, and then you bring it into like a modern, war of targeted assassinations. They're trying to modernize aerial dispersion to destroy the cocoa plantations with drones. To be a little bit critical of that, also, like the last president who signed the peace agreement, who was the promoter of the peace agreement, he may have had good intentions, but he was also the Minister of Defense under the most brutal president, right-wing president that we've ever had. So I think it is important to also question what this is. Peace agreements in Colombia have worked in a different way, I think. The previous peace agreements have brought politically oppressed sectors into politics. There has been an incredible amount of targeted assassinations regarding a last peace agreement that was done also with a political group that was called the UP. Over 3,000 people were killed for their supposed affiliation to guerrillas. So what we're going to see is a revamping of violence, I think. The peace agreement also has a problem, is that in the incredible way that it is formulated, which is, I think, most of it is quite incredible, actually. And it would be very good if the country were to implement it, because it changes basically the way that the rural society, the rural parts of society are structured. There is, land distribution changes, basically, like for development. Every single, vereda, every single small compartment has to do like a new territorial ordering plot that is participative and collaborative. So it's something very significant and very important, but it's not really being pursued by the government, which just shows us that we're going on a loop, and we've been going on this loop for if not 50 years at least.
Thank you. But I'm wondering, and maybe I will go to you, Nelson, about the hope and the after. If you regard the situation, some similarity regarding the Afro-Colombian situation, where they are racialized until now, and they have to wait until 1991 to be included as a Colombian citizen, 1991. Don't forget that, it's really impressive. And also the situation in South Africa, because you know pretty well the situation about the South African. And I would like get your input about the truth, reconciliation or peace agreement without truth and reconciliation. May I please ask you to answer?
I'll give you a few thoughts about that, and also I want to share some comments with Manuel precisely about the question of hope and the day after. How can the film may able to shed new light about this, or how do you think shedding new light about this? I do think that watching the film makes the theme, hope and the day after, even maybe more particularly palpable. And so I would like to build from that. And even to look at yesterday and the performance of the Cahiers notebook of A Return to Native Land in relation to the film. Right? Imagine what would be the native land, a return to the native land when the native land is engaged in warfare. Right? For those of you who have come out from the,
never return.
Yeah. So, and is that hope or the day after? So in South Africa, you may know that in the last few years there have been various movements calling for the decolonization of the university, for free and decolonized education, for stopping fees, and so on. And that those movements had a national impact. But I think that in part, the root of those movements is kind of the disenchantment of the youth with the promise of a rainbow nation. Right? And they very emotionally describe how their parents when 1994 came and Mandela came to power, the day after he came to power, their parents have to go to work in the same places with the same white owners, with the same white bosses, and so on. And of course, not too much change in that relationship. So what changed was a lot of suspicion from the part of the bosses about and some say that their bosses try to intimidate the people so that they would not work, they did not vote for Mandela. They should not even indicate that they had any sympathy with ANC while they were in front of them. And the next day, the day after, it was expected to be like that. They needed to hide it, right? But the fact is that at the end, whether they had it or not, they remain in that relationship, impoverished, excluded, minoritized, even when they are the majority, numeric demographic majority in the country. But even then, there was the notion, but democracy now has come and everything will change soon. So now we prepare. And so the kids were raised thinking that, okay, we're going to get there. And when they go to school and when they go to the university, and that they find that the situation is meager, hardly any fundamental changes, then the rage, right, comes, and they want to then really confront the state, the democratic state, and they're calling from decolonization of that state. So then there is a new struggle, right? And even though the idea of reconciliation, supposedly reconciliation, have come up and so on, but no actual reparations. No act of reparation. So it seems that without reparations, there is ultimately no truth telling and not or achievement of the truth or reconciliation at the end. So maybe this is what speaks about, so that the result of these commissions, they lift, even though they create even a new constitution and so on, it doesn't. Without fundamental economic, socio-political changes, then the daily warfare of exclusion and subordination and anti-black racism continues. So I don't know, I could say that. I had some other comments about about what the film means for the theme, because it seems the question that is clearly when we think about hope and the day after, the idea is that we can hope for anything, and in these circumstances and this context, it is reasonable for one to hope, for the parents to hope that the disappear will appear, for example, right? Or at least the bodies will appear, that they could close that chapter or rejoin their daughters, their sons, their family. But also, hope and the day after means that even if they do that, the history doesn't end there. History continues. The day after means that it is always open. And if it is always open, maybe another war can happen. Maybe the war will continue. Maybe the war will return. And therefore, we need new hopes. So hopes never finish. There will be hope, or will there be hope after the day after? Right? But I think that in a way, the play and maybe the film itself is our affirmations of that hope in practice, of in the middle of the war, coming together, making community, sharing the story, and trying to make sense, meaning in the way that Luis was talking about before, of reality together. And that in itself may be, a kind of affirmation of life, even in the context or in the midst of that war. That takes me to the play yesterday with the Le Cahier, the notebooks, because in a way for an Afro-Caribbean subject who leaves the land and then comes back, I think, or plans to come back, there is also that question of the systematic amount of suffering that has been kind of condensed in the Caribbean. And therefore the idea is you live from that warring context to another warring context, which is Paris. And then you want to come back. But who will come back is different. And of course, when you come back, there will be new wars. When you come back, as SSR clearly as a mayor of Fort-de-France, so we have attested. So I don't know. Those are some ideas about the situation in South Africa, how it relates to this. It keeps the question. I mean, the question of reconciliation open even after you sign, new treaties. But also, I was thinking about or sharing some comments to see if you could elaborate a bit more, or what your response will be to these ideas about the relationship of the film with the team Hope and the Day After.
Just, I ask this question to three of you. What do you think it could be? Hope without reparation for the future? And I ask that because if the history was different, normally the enslaved have to be compensated. I don't think compensate is the right word, but something like compensate. Therefore, is the word be changed or not? And I am asking that because with this title I was a little bit upset with. It is interesting, but for me it's something paradoxal. And I'm really wondering, could we build hope and day after without solving or repairing the violation of humanity, of human, in terms of dignity and equality? Who wants answer?
I can actually.
But I think it would be interesting to have the
Yeah,
three
like,
voice.
just really briefly, just like as a parenthesis, I will answer the question that you asked me. Yes, I mean, like, this film was shot right after the peace agreement was signed. So it's, like, maybe this is my Saturday metaphor, right? This is about the moment when we were drinking all the hope. And right now we are, paying for the hope we drank. So we don't really have too much hope in this moment. And about reparations, which I think is very, very crucial, and it really is, at the heart of like post-conflict resolution. It's there are many ways that I'm seeing, reparations unfolding in different spaces. In Colombia, for instance, there is something very aggressive. Is that there is the state will repair you if you have family that was disappeared, if you can prove this. Which is very difficult. It's an ordeal, even when you have like very solid evidence, as the woman that appears in the film that shows the pictures of the exhumation of her son. She has archive that is World Heritage. It's been cataloged because it was a very intense search for her disappeared son. The military general that ordered the killing has appeared on TV with her, said, "I am sorry, I did it." And the government refuses to accept this as evidence. So they have not paid her case. So there is a big problem as well that war victims will tell you in Colombia, is that to be a victim and to be repaired forces you to enact a permanent state of victimhood as a public performance, which is very, it's very complicated because you have a state that is corrupt, doesn't actually want to do the reparations they only want to do them in paper so that they look good somehow. Other things that you see, for example, in South Africa, the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission was very examined by the Colombian Truth and Reconciliation Commission, as I'm sure you know. But there was, the heavy weight on the South African Commission was placed on exchanging truth for amnesty. So you're exchanging memory for amnesia, right? So you are, trying to move forward in this sense. In Spain, for instance, reparations are happening through what they call an amnestic justice. So it's against amnesty. It's about remembering, remembering, and memory itself becomes the quintessential ground for contention, because now the perpetrators of Franco-era crimes are dead. There's nobody to prosecute. So right now it's only memory that is at stake, and even for like a lot of people, this is more than enough to fight all their lives for. So that they get recognized that their father wasn't killed because he was a rapist, he was killed because he was a socialist. So this is very important. And I think in Colombia, we don't really know very well. I mean, we've incorporated a lot of incredible mechanisms to find truth. For example, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Colombia cannot actually, point to perpetrators. It can only show patterns. It only has a pedagogical and widespread.
Resilience.
It's about resilience mostly, but I think I personally think there is some value in knowing who did what for which reasons and having them prosecuted, or if there's no jail sentences, which I disagree with jail in any case. I think but I think we need to know who did it, so that maybe businesses can boycott them. I mean, even just that forms of justice of sorts that don't include necessarily people going into jail, but there's no spaces. One of the big problems as well is that there's no spaces of encounter. So in this film, you see the paramilitaries that were convicted for war crimes were in jails, and the mothers were able to reach them at first and talk to them and get information about where the mass graves were, which is the reason why we did this display. It's not. I couldn't make it explicit in the film because of political reasons, but the reason why we made the play is because they didn't want to let the war victims, or actually rather the war survivors, as they self-identify, they didn't want to let us into jail because there was a corruption scandal. So they basically made it impossible and illegal. And then I was talking to a friend of my mom, and she said, "Oh yes, I have a theater group and I bring theater to the inmates," and I'm like, that's a good idea. Let's make a theater play and just tell jails that we're a theater collective. And this is what we did, and it was very effective because it also appealed to their emotions, and so they kept doing it for a while. But all to bring it to a loop. This is what I think reparations are, and I think if there's no space for encountering what actually happened. So not even memory, or not even justice in the sense of memory. I mean, we're starting from a really bad.
Yes, but I was not thinking about individual reparation, and as I know, there is also a truth reconciliation organized by Colombian state. But aside, there is also another truth and other. I don't know if civil society or some organization organizing another kind of reconciliation commission because they don't believe in what the state is doing. And from this point of view, it's problematic. But I was not thinking about individual reparation. I was thinking really, because we have also another example you did not mention, but it's Rwanda with the gachacha. With the state, the Rwanda state organized a reconciliation through what they call gachacha. It's a kind of tribunal between peer. And the people were sentenced. They were put in jail, the responsible of crime. But it's also interesting because for the first time, one state organized its own tribunal and to get justice from their own input and not from abroad, coming from abroad. For that it is interesting. But I'm speaking about reparation more on the as a way to not repair people, and not. I think also maybe reparation is not the proper word. Maybe it's restoration. I don't know exactly but to restore the sense, what Nelson said about sense of alterity, sense of intersubjectivity. For example, in the Colombian society, and the most affected people, and they are totally forgot, it's Afro-Colombian. And if there is one part of the society who has to benefit of the end of this civil war, is Afro-Colombian. And they were excluded of this peace agreement. Even if there is a law for reattribution, land reappropriation, they are excluded of that because it's took a lot of time, and they are all the time defeat about that. And I was asking about hope and day after for the people who are excluded, not for the, in fact, not for all the society, but for the people who are, how as they are deprived of hope since years and years, how the peace agreement and how the end of apartheid could bring hope and restore the sense of alterity for all these people who are excluded, dehumanized, and decivilized by their colonizer. It is a
Question.
A question. But thank you.
Do you want to say something? I can.
You can sense it. I would like to call your attention towards three elements. Two of them are in the film. The third one was in the first performance that we saw yesterday, courtesy of the Funk Collective. And the third one speaks to the title of this panel. It was a call for a Decolonial International, and I would like to try and flesh that out and at the same time say something about Mireille's question. But let me introduce the other two elements, the ones that come from the film first. The first one I thought was very striking, and I could see the audience also picked it up. Did you see those scenes in which neuroscientists were trying to measure something? What was it that they were trying to measure? Well, they were trying to measure empathy. The questions that were being asked of the test subjects. The mothers were the test subjects. They are, of course, also, as Louis would have put it, our ancestors. The disappeared person that I invoked as I began introducing this panel is also an ancestor, literally. She's neither dead nor alive. And that element of empathy is absolutely crucial in order to understand what has happened to human rights practices and transitional justice practices. Because what you witness in that film is what we have witnessed in South Africa, in Rwanda, in Argentina, time and time again. And this is the transposition of human rights themselves from the realm of political mobilization to the realm of mass popular culture. And popular culture works through the consumption of images, basically photographies of agony. And the aim, the alleged objective, is that you as a consumer of images in your many devices, in your many screens, would switch from apathy to empathy. The thesis behind this seems to be that if only you and everybody else were to switch from apathy to empathy, then you would understand that you allowed this to happen because you lack sufficient empathy or were somehow inattentive to the facts. This is deeply problematic. Because at the same time, that very same culture is telling you that you're not really responsible because of your relationship to the perpetrators or your positionality in, and this is the second element in the film, the one word that is never used in this Manichaean logic driving transitional justice and peace agreements. The binary is in between victims and perpetrators. The word that you never hear is beneficiaries. Who benefited from these wars? These wars are very, very, very concrete. They are about taking the land, and you saw it. And you saw that it's a fantastic character. The mother playing the paramilitary chieftain who is laughing. In a sense, she's not portraying a paramilitary chieftain because the paramilitaries carried, for the most part, and this is the case in Colombia, as it is the case now, right now, last week in Brazil, in the south of Brazil, they just carry out the material part of the business. The person who is behind is usually being landowners, and many of them acquire very quickly political power. The nefarious president, whose name shall not be spoken, that Manuel referred to, is precisely one such big landowner who acquired political power, and that's pretty much the situation across the Americas. These big landowners, this sort of emerging bourgeoisie, using their newly acquired wealth in order to buy political power. Now, again, what you must understand is that a human rights discourse and practice that works on such a basis is not interested at all in hearing about beneficiaries. And this is the reason why questions concerning reparations are never even theorized. This is also the blind spot of international law after World War II, and in particular the international law of human rights. If you revise the records of the Nuremberg tribunals, you learn that members of the Frankfurt Critical Theory group who were advising the US prosecutorial team were very clear in their understanding that what had propped up Nazism in Germany were a bunch of industrialists. And they named them, and they urged the US prosecutorial team to put them on the dock. The United States decided not to do so, because the economic reconstruction of Germany and Europe became more important, which is why, as you come up and down this building, you go into the lift, and you look at who produced that lift, and you see ThyssenKrupp. It's the same guys, reinvented. But that blind spot has remained with us. And of course there is a reason why that is the case. If we were to shine a light on that, we would have to come up to the logical conclusion that what is behind fascism is capitalism. That capitalism has no problem with young men, usually young white men, and you saw them in the film, in brown shirts or in the case of Bolivia, white T-shirts with green flags and a cross. They're now in power in Bolivia. They're hunting Indians, Amerindians as we speak. And here we are, us, the intellectuals, the so-called decolonials, arguing whether this was decolonial or who is not decolonial, whether this was a coup or not a coup. And while we argue about the purity of our definitions, a political reality is set in place. And we end up, as a colleague of us who couldn't join us today would have said, we end up carrying the water for the fascists or the neo-fascists. So that's a very crucial element. If that is the case, if human rights practices are now just part of an image-driven popular culture, the question becomes, how do we snap ourselves out of this dream? We are in that dream. I am in that dream. It's a nightmare. It's a recurring nightmare. It's a loop. Earlier this year, my writing hit a brick wall. In fact, 2 brick walls. So I did what a dear friend asked me to do. Go and take a walk. And I've been doing that for the last 4 months. I returned a week ago. I've been... This is not coincidence, of course. I've been to Bolivia, Venezuela, Colombia, Chile, and Brazil. And what I witnessed in the last 3 or 4 weeks, particularly in Chile and in Colombia, is striking. In Chile, I witnessed a younger generation, actually 3 younger generations, recomposing the memory that had been erased from them. Because, of course, that's what fascism aims at, to erase your immediate past so that you have no tools with which to visualize a future hope. In the case of Chile, for different reasons, left-wing parents did not tell the story to their kids because they wanted to protect them. Right-wing parents did not tell them the story because they did not want them contaminated. So what the kids did, and I think this is a lesson to us all, they went back and recomposed their own memory. And it is on the basis of their recomposed memory that they are beginning to visualize a different future. So when they ask the Chilean government, they have been doing this since 2006 at the very least, to fund higher education and primary education. And the neoliberal government of Chile, which I don't have to remind you, is ground zero of neoliberalism, responds, we don't have the money with which to fund that, just as our Tory government has been doing here for what seems forever. And I dread to see or to think about what is going to happen the next 12th December. What the kids respond is, well, simple. Go back, nationalize the copper industry, as Allende did back in '73, and there you have the money with which to fund our education. So you see how the immediate past becomes a tool. And this is also an example of what we could call reparations. How do we rethink reparations? And with this, I finish, and I promise not to speak anymore. How can we rethink reparations in the age of spectacle and finance? Well, one thing is very clear. When people take to the streets and begin to protest, not symbolically, not Extinction Rebellion-like protest, which you go, you do that, is great, fantastic, and so on, and then they withdraw. But actually, as the kids in various cities in Chile are doing, as the kids in various cities of Colombia are doing, as we saw this earlier today, our friends in New York City are doing, if you remain in the streets long enough, that begins to pose a serious risk to capital flows. Because of course, the stock exchange is closed, the businesses are not happening, and so on and so forth. And when that happens, it is the captains of industry who go and tell the puppet governments. We call in Colombia, we don't call our president the president, we call it the sub-president. They go and tell him, now we're ready to negotiate. So one way of rethinking reparations or restorative justice, I don't like the term restoration that much. I'm happy to call it revolutionary justice because isn't it the case, Jorge, that revolution is precisely a kind of cyclical journey of a planet, something like that? We may be able to rethink reparations as groups of people taking to the streets and remaining in the streets in the knowledge that if they remain there for long enough, because they pose and they incarnate a risk to capital flows, then they can extract a premium from the industrialists with which to fund greater justice. And if you listen to what the students in Chile are saying, what the Committee of the National Strike is saying in Colombia, that's exactly what they're asking for. This is no longer a particular demand, which may end up legitimating the government because, you know the dynamic. We protest, the government says no. We protest again, the government says no again. And there we are, paralyzed in that sort. And those are, let's be frank, those have become our intellectual discussions. Horizontalism, purity, ironic distance from the state. Well, I'm sorry, but your discussions about whether, to reach the state or to be at a distance from the state mean nothing to the women here, because as you heard them saying, well, the state there has never existed. So But if they can take to the street and extract this premium, negotiate this premium, as it is done in the financial system, and look at what they're doing, inverting the way in which wealth is created in the financial system, and weaponizing it, dare I say, for the purposes of revolution, or at least a revolution in construction. This is my nod to Colectiva Feminista en Construcción. Well, then you can fund greater justice. And you will no longer take that line repeated ad nauseam. We cannot pay for that. Sorry. We want education. No, fuck you. We cannot pay for that. And then us, the lecturers and so on, we go on a strike and nobody gives a damn. We've been on a strike. Well, not Birkbeck, because we were idiot enough not to even reach 50% in our balloting. But our comrades have been on strike for 8 days now, and you wouldn't know it, because nobody cares. Yeah. Or they say, Brexit. He's to blame. The immigrant is to blame, you see? Or what Bolsonaro does in Brazil. Oh, the universities are filled with communists. They are the ones. Those petty moral victories, of course, are the kinds of victories with which to replace the fact that there are no material victories. That the fascists can never offer material victories. So they offer you this sort of displaced sucedáneo, we say in Spanish. So there we are, a rearticulation of justice, not reparation, perhaps justice as an option, and a very clear diagnosis of precisely what has happened to human rights and other progressive discourses, perhaps including decolonial theory, that render them toothless.
Thank you. And I just have just a brief few comments about the question of particularly those who seem to be in the position of being hopeless, those who, like the Afro-Colombians, those who have been left completely in the margins of a discussion of a project for truth, reconciliation, or reparation, right? So that they are constitutively outside of that process. Because it seems to me that it is from that position of being outside of that process, from the condition of hopelessness, that the idea, maybe the hope, for the decolonial transnational emerges. The call for a decolonial transnational has been put forward by a group, kind of decolonial formations in Europe, that organized last year the Bandung of the North conference, in which the Frantz Fanon Foundation participated. The third Rencontres of the Frantz Fanon of the Foundation last year was also in conversation with that encounter of Bandung of the North, and that's why the topic of the Rencontres last year, if this year is hope, and the day after, last year was Fanon, decoloniality, and the spirit of Bandung. And so we were in connection with this call for a decolonial international. Again, which emerges from groups of racialized subjects in the interior of Europe. Many of them from former colonies in the Caribbean, in North Africa, in different parts of Africa. Right? And so they feel like these hopeless subjects within the European states, where you find something like this, between the conservatives and sort of the radicals, but both tend to be quite ignorant of issues of communities of color in those contexts, right? So even the question of things like when groups ask for something for education, like for the state to pay education, right? But then what education is going to be taught in the university? Right? It's a question. In Chile, what about the claims for epistemic reparation of systemic justice from the part of the Mapuches, right? Not to talk about land and all these other aspects Right? So that remains the question of decolonization alongside the questions of a different division of the riches. Right? And so I think that the call for international, decolonial international, is precisely for since we are recognizing our disconnection, our marginalization, then let's take each other seriously in our society, across the different sectors, right? From different histories, different parts of the global south, and we're here in the different metropolis of the north and those in the south. And in this case, I find, for example, that a dialogue between the movement for the public support of education in the U.S. throughout Latin America has something to gain with a kind of a active dialogue and engagement with the South African movement for a free and decolonial education, which involves also the question of land, the decolonization of society, the economy, right? That's the box that the students sort of open. And so this is part of, in a way, the Decolonial International, the project, right? Maybe the hope, but it's also the realization, what is there. Les Indigènes de la République in France are a decolonial formation of different, right? It's international within France. Decolonize this place is a decolonial formation in New York City, but it's very plural and international also. Right? And La Colectiva Feminista are different women activists from Puerto Rico, but from different sectors as well. And also in conversation with what's happened, they will tell you the strike in Guadalupe when they occur, taking that kind of that legacy of the ancestors who have struggled in nearby islands in Latin America and other places of the global south as serious interlocutors. So that's the notion of a decolonial international. Maybe not only to take each other seriously, learn from each other, build bridges among each other, and in that sense, also in this encounter, in these 2 days, where we have DTP, Decolonize This Place, we have the Fund Collective, we have also the Colectiva, other organizations. This is our little effort of creating a tiny decolonial formation, the Decolonial International, through the Rencontres. So I wonder if the Rencontres are the places where the hopeless, among other places, where we come together to try to have some kind of hope, but the hope is our very practice. That is the seed of what we want to grow. But as Fanon said, we don't know what will happen tomorrow, but still it's an imperative. We are going to do it for as long as we have breath.
Thank you. Do you have something to add?
Perhaps the audience.
Oh, sorry. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
I
there
missed.
you are.
Oh, sorry. Is there some question? Okay, we have here one mic. Thank you to 3 of you. Thank you. Thank you for your work.
Got my workout.
Me, okay. Thanks, hi. So, Oscar, my question, I absolutely agree with everything you say about reparation and its context. I just think that, from the South African experience, what has happened is you have the articulation very clearly of a critique of the beneficiary. Mahmoud Mamdani's devastating critique of the TRC's report, focusing on the beneficiary. It is inserted into the discourse, but at points where it has absolutely no structural effect. So what happens is that it goes around, but in terms of structural change, there is none. And the reason, I think, is, of course, because it is the very beneficiaries who are occupying the corridors or who are populating the corridors of power. And so the question becomes, how do you change that dynamic? How do how do you infiltrate the corridors of power with something that can become more receptive to reparation? So that's my first question. My second question is to Professor Maldonado Torres. The question is about, and I've been thinking about this myself, is we know that hundreds, if not thousands of people came to the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission. They participated in it. They told their stories, often at great cost. There's nothing to suggest that they were unduly manipulated, I would say, or at least for many of them, there was not a sense or of inauthenticity of the experience. And I'm wondering about how do we continue rightly and rightfully critiquing the TRC and the Truth and Reconciliation process and the whole Rainbow Nation thing without dishonoring the very real, very authentic experiences that did take place around the TRC, without erasing those stories. So how do we keep both in play and allow the one not to overwhelm, as it were, the other, but yet still critique it?
It's good to see you. So good to see you, Jacob. Let me attempt to provide 3 concrete examples of what you called infiltration. They operate at different levels, in different scales. The first one is perhaps of a grander scale, and you all know it. You all know that for the last decade and a half, progressive governments, let's call them that for lack of a better term, were elected in most countries in Latin America, or in the Americas as a whole. And they were more receptive to precisely the kinds of historical claims that you were talking about. That kind of political intervention is, I believe, and I believe this against many of my colleagues who think that the error of the Movimiento al Socialismo in Bolivia or the Workers' Party in Brazil or Colombia Humana in Colombia and so on and so forth was precisely to try and vie for power. I think that is still valid. And the measure of its validity was just proven by the violence with which the fascists in Bolivia had to use in order to dislodge the movement towards socialism. And I have to say this, I no longer have time for academic debates concerning the purity of leftists and or the moralization of politics and or the purity of definitions concerning this or that shade of decoloniality. I have no more time for that. So that's my first example. Those governments, some of them have been dislodged from power, others are still there, they are latent. Those governments are not just political parties, they are exemplary of a sort of dual power network, which is both horizontalist and has a vertical flight, and we should not relinquish that tool. We should not fall for the idea that somehow if you remain at an ironic distance from power, then you are purer, and then if you conform, you are just a conservative. That dualism, as Louis Gordon and others, other colleagues here at Birkbeck have taught us, those dualisms claiming a non-ideological position are the very mark of ideology in our time. My second example, at a very different scale, is precisely the kind of artistic practices that Manuel, Omar Rincon, other friends such as Oscar Murillo have been attempting. What you saw in this film, and I think, I'm sorry Manuel, but you're going to have to make it explicit somehow in the film, that actually your little trick of a play within the play is really a play on us, the audience. Because when you tell us that actually this is the way you infiltrated the prison and allowed the mothers to engage with the perpetrators, my God, the whole fucking film changes. It changes. I was like, ugh. How did I not see that Hitchcockian twist? There is a lot of that in the art practices of many of our contemporary friends and colleagues, and I think it is very important to learn from that and to use it as a tool. It wasn't at all a coincidence that Oscar and the others became a collective for the purposes of the Turner Prize. By the way, he says hi. He was going to join us, but he's fed up with the limelight, so he jet off to El Pueblo en Colombia. My third example is the one that Nelson just invoked. The spirit of Bandung traveled from Asia through the tricontinental gathering in Havana in 1966. And that connection was absolutely crucial, and it is our best model for a kind of internationalism. By the way, as Anne Garland Mahler has demonstrated in her wonderful book on the tricontinental, that kind of aesthetics, which she terms a metonymy of color, because color had nothing to do with chromatism for these artists and fighters and activists, but actually became the site of an anti-imperial position. So it wouldn't matter whether you were beige, brown, black, for as long as you were occupying that anti-imperial position. To put it in the terms of Article 4 of the Haitian Constitution of 1804, you are black. And that's what matters. There is a huge lesson there. Political, theoretical, ethical. You reminded us of that lesson, Jorge, this morning. So there is plenty of research to do. There is plenty to learn from. What was this tricontinental aesthetics all about? Why I didn't know, that's exactly what I was thinking when, together with some friends, with Leticia Coyo and others, we said, this is focused on the funk. We were actually invoking those ancestors, but we did not know that. Why the fuck we did not know that? Why they haven't taught us that? And that's a huge problem because I'm also a teacher. So what the fuck am I teaching my students? And this has become a serious problem for me. I teach in many places. One of them is a law school. And what do we teach our students in law schools? To read. And because we're critical, we teach them to read critically, between the lines, but we teach them to read texts all the time. But they are surrounded by images. And we, teachers, know not how to teach them to read images critically. So perhaps I will begin very humbly there. I'll try to school myself in how to read images more critically. And for that, Manuel, I'm going to need your help.
Sure.
With regard to the question about how not to maybe dishonor the memories, the narratives that were told authentically in the process of the TRC, I think it's important to differentiate that itself, the testimony, the memory, with the structure that serve as a conduit for those memories to come out. Right? So recognizing one, the authenticity, if you will, if we want to use that word of one, doesn't commit you to then having to accept the parameters and the goals of the other. And in fact, the other one remains open to criticism. Even more, not only open to criticism, the criticism might be called for by the very testimonies themselves, that in that moment, in that current form, could not flesh out in the terms of a demand, larger demand. So the word implicit, maybe explicit, but at that moment, with the hope being that maybe there will be that transformation, right? There will be a transformation. But when the transformation doesn't come, right? And then you realize that all along the structure was not really facilitating it, then the structure itself can become a radical object of critique without, I don't think dishonoring, but on the contrary, trying to rescue the value so that it doesn't become as problematic as the structure itself. Is there time for more questions?
Is there more question? The mic is coming.
More than a question, is a comment and a reflection. I don't like the Olympiads of suffering, but I belong to the Association of the Relatives of the Disappeared in Chile. And I think hope goes with fear. Hope is something that is usually challenged by fear. Disappearance is something that really, really goes to your bones and is used as a political weapon to demobilize any political action. And the motherhood, in these cases, throughout Latin America, was a real strong weapon. We lost fear. That was the only thing that motherhood, being a mother or a sister, gave you that power to challenge the other strong power. So it's just a comment, and the film made me cry once again, because it's exactly what we live through, and that sort of in-betweenness of being the fighter, those mothers challenging power. It was again in this film, and I could see that woman regaining, going back for the pieces of bones. Is that hope? I wonder. I just do not like to think about hope. Hope paralyzes us because we're thinking about the future. What is the future? To gather a piece of bone and being like the Spaniards, the grandchildren of. So I think we have to combat fear. And by combating fear, we might have some hope. Thank you.
Because in Spanish, if I'm right,
Turn on the mic.
what?
The mic is
It's
on.
off.
Red button at the left.
Here. Oh yes. Sorry. In Spanish, espectar, esperanza, it's a wait. No, to wait. That's why I want some comment about that. No?
No, it's not the same, but of course they have a shared root. Esperanza and esperar.
No, espectar. Espectar? No?
Do you mean hope?
Yeah.
Hope
Expect-
is esperanza.
Esperanza, but espectar, it's coming from expectar. Expectar is wait.
Esperar, yes, it's correct.
We need Luis here. We need an etymologist.
No, it's just.
Yeah, it's the same root.
It's the same.
Esperar and esperanza. They are
No, it's just related to what you said. It's to wait. Hope is to wait something for an achievement of something, and for me, it's something. In this regard, it's something more negative than positive, than proactive.
Just very quickly, of course, this is a very good example of a creolized word in the Americas. Many etymological roots Of course, if you go back to the Latin and to a Christianized Latin, you already have an ambivalence between an anticipated reality or an anticipatory action, which is the very opposite of waiting to, or sitting down and wait for it to happen. But of course, there is also that sort of interval that opens up in which, of course, there is no guarantee. And I like that ambivalence very much, actually. I usually tell my students that the only lesson that critical thinking gives us is that no one knows the end of the story beforehand. Ergo, you have to do it. You have to go, even if you don't know, even if there are no a priori guarantees that it will be achieved. But we also heard this morning about other roots of that kind of terminology, the visualization element. And I think that's very important. At least those of us who like our philosophical ramblings might play with those two meanings of the term sense. Not just significance, not just speech acts, but the act. That is to say, esperanza, or hope, is also a vector of action. It's a driver. It motivates you, it pushes you. And it was very beautiful to listen to Jorge this morning because we're very near the Barbo Institute, and you're immediately reminded of what Francis Yates used to say about the same philosophical tradition that Ernst Bloch called the Aristotelian left. Marcellus Ficinus, whom you quoted this morning, he used to say that, of course, all the forward-looking movements of history, those that produce and open the future, always draw their emotional force and drive looking backwards. And that apparent paradox is rich, beautiful, and it gives us loads to think about and to work with.
Yes. Okay, you finish us off.
The mic has died again.
Thank you. Okay, quick one again. Another problem or issue with hope is that, of course, it can propel us to a future in anticipation, but then to come back to Louis, for the right wing, that future is a future without so many of us. Right? It's a future deprived of difference. It's a future deprived of the left. It's a future deprived of queer people, of people of color, and so on. That's hope. Right? So they can also use hope, the hope of having, a country without indigenous people, right? Countries like that are called the US, are called Australia, become real countries, real projects. So I think that what I would like to anchor hope, if it's going to be used, when it's going to be used, next to the idea of the decolonial imperative. The fact that whether with hope or no hope, what needs to be done is to decolonize. Why? Because we live in a context that is massively colonized, that is still living the episode, the long night of the 500 years that the Zapatistas talks about, right? That a world where there are still direct colonial relationships, like the case of Puerto Rico, for example, but also multiple forms of coloniality across society and even within nation states, including the North and the South. And insofar as that structure remains dominant, the structure of feeling, of thoughts, of institutions, insofar as it remains installed, then the coloniality is an imperative. Then, if there needs to be hope, hope will be the colonial hope. And if not, then, and if we lose hope, we still need to do what needs to be done. Fanon begins his Black White Mass saying, the explosion will not happen today, it's too soon or too late. So even in that moment when you don't even know, maybe it's too late. Maybe it's too late. There seems no hope for the explosion to come, and yet I must write. And yet I must say something, and yet I must act. But if I act, and I have encountered, like he began to encounter in Algeria, a movement and the possibility of a revolution, then maybe hope becomes a reality there. But never ontologize, right? Never knowing that it can disappear and you still are committed. Whether the explosion will not come or whether you see the explosion happening and then you think that, okay, maybe we can win this and maybe we can build another kind of society. Right? So those are other kind of reflections about hope, and I think the need to keep in mind that hope by itself can lead in different directions, and that we should appreciate the input, the contributions, but not avoid ontologizing it also.
Yeah, I'll just say something very quickly in response to the Chilean woman who asked and made a comment earlier. Is I don't think in any way, sorry, can you hear me? I don't think in any way there's hope that of this mother in finding the bones. I think what happens is that the stories of disappearance are always told in medias res. It's the story of an omitted beginning. It's violence against evidence that refuses to narrate the story. So we do not know where the disappeared are. We do not know who killed them. We do not know anything about them. So for them, what there is, I think, would not be hope. It's curiosity in a sense, in some cases. Of course, I worked, with the mothers in Colombia for around 4 years, and they all had, each one in individual cases had different, ideas of how they wanted to be repaired. Some wanted to find them, their bones. Some, didn't want anything to do with it and just wanted it to be over. But I don't think in this case hope is what is at stake. I think in this case what is at stake is the fight against the powers that seek to delete people from existence. I think the logic behind disappearance, of course, is eliminating those who think differently. It's the logic of a genocide that happens, through targeted assassinations, political kidnappings, etc. But it is in essence an absolute impossibility of sharing, time and space together. So I think, a question is, how do we, start? Maybe I don't know the role that hope can play into this, but maybe we can think, how do we use these experiences of the past to, construct a different future? But the thing is that, like, in terms of reparations, again, if we bring this again, unless the disappeared are found, for a lot of cases, and I do really think that reparation happens on an individual level, because, for example, in Spain, daughters and granddaughters that have been looking for their disappeared fathers are still looking for them, even in their 80s, even in their 90s. They are looking for them. So, when we are talking about, open wounds, we're not talking metaphorically, but we're talking about actual open wounds of people that, were, deprived of their family. And in the case of Chile, there's a lot of, work that has, that we've learned. In Mexico as well, but in Chile there was a lot of work legally that was quite interesting. Is the judge Juan Salvador Guzmán Tapia decided that because we do not know if the disappeared are dead or alive, they are therefore alive. We don't have certificate of their death, so their status as being kidnapped is continual, and the crime happens the moment that the bodies are found. So it's a crime that projects infinitely into the future. And I think in a way, so does the traumatic repercussions of it, because a lot of times parents, etc., don't have the answers for their children of what happened to their father, to their mother. So this insufficient information creates these holes that then enter the entire system, the entire society that we're trying to build. It's full of holes. We don't know where these people are, who killed them, why. Again, we don't know who benefited from this, because in many cases there was beneficiaries that were, of course, people in corporations wanted to, remove some, farmers from their land, get rid of them, or people who were fighting for different political systems, get rid of them. And unless we start, taking a collective economic action in their own terms, nationalizing, the businesses of wrongdoers, for instance, of people that, were, part of disappearances, targeted assassinations, etc. We won't go anywhere. Because right now what we're seeing in Colombia is that we see the targeted assassination of almost 400 people, and then the government says, oh, it was the mafias. Of course it was not the mafias. I mean, like, how many years have we been, going around? We know that, probably it was, paramilitary groups paid by the mafias, yes, sure, acting on military intelligence, probably, or on orders, by business owners who decided to finance them. So we have, a huge story of, violence against evidence, a story that refuses to be narrated, that is constructed precisely to refuse to be narrated, and then what do we do with this? Where do we find, hope?
Okay, thank you. I think after this panel, I think we have to continue for the next rencontre, the discussion on towards and decolonial international issue. I think we have to continue. And now it's the next panel, right? The next panel is Finance Orientation, Decolonize the Place. Thank you to all of us.